Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to another episode of Wrecking Ball. We're that podcast from the Historical Society of the New York Courts where we talk about things that are at the intersection of historic preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. Now, we are taking a trip officially up the Hudson River to a location that is really at the crossroads of all three of those themes of our podcast: preservation, the law, and New York. And that is, of course, Empire State Plaza, which is that modernist seat of New York state government that's located on the shores of the mighty Hudson River in Albany, New York. And speaking of mighty, we do have two mighty women in their respective fields on our panel here today. The Honorable Margaret Cangilos-Ruiz, who retired with distinction from the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of New York, where she served as chief judge, overseeing judges and court operations across the Northern District of New York, including the Albany Division. She has deep professional and family roots in the Albany area and was an active participant in civic and legal affairs there for many decades. So the Empire State Plaza and its surroundings, they really served as the stage set for much of her professional and personal life. So welcome, Judge. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And before we move on to our second panelist, I will say in the Department of Old Habits Dying Hard, I am the judge's former law clerk, and so while we may slip and call her judge every now and again, just to clarify, she is fully retired from that court, so welcome once again. And we also have, as our co-panelist today, overjoyed to have Carol herself, Krinsky, who's professor of art history at New York University, where she has served with distinction since 1965. She's an expert on 20th century modern architecture, and her writings on the Empire State Plaza, or the Albany Mall, as it's also known, those writings are informed by her research and her real-life experiences interviewing figures like Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who's typically credited with conceiving and championing the Albany Mall project. Dr. Krinsky, welcome to Wrecking Ball.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to have you as well. And I'd like to start with you, Judge, because as we alluded to up front, that city of Albany, it holds a special place in your heart, and I think in the hearts of a lot of our listeners. So if you wouldn't mind just situating us a little bit, what is Albany and why does it matter to the great state of New York?
Well, I grew up in the 50s in Albany, and it is has a wonderful history. The Dongan Charter that goes back 300 years. I was there for the 300th year history. That celebrated the founding of Albany, and I loved the shirt that said Albany 300 years still making history. I knew Albany in the 50s, which was a very vibrant community. There were swim lessons that we would walk to. I did not grow up in the area of the South Mall, as it's called, but I was able to walk many places, and we could walk downtown. And my dad was employed by the Attorney General's office, and he would walk down to the predecessor buildings before the South Mall was created, and then it was the Department of Justice, and I was there also. But Albany has been a beacon on a hill. We have Henry Hobson Richardson buildings, the City Hall. There's a wonderful townhouse that is in the city. And we also have a Frederick Law Olmsted Park, Washington Park. So we have had many important monuments before the South Mall came to be. And as the capital of the Empire State, I've always had great pride in being from the city.
Absolutely. It is truly a prideful place. And, there was a visitor who arrived in Albany, and these visitors show up every 2 or 4 years, right? Because as the judge alluded to, it is the capital city of this state. And so as a result, you have permanent residents, and then you have people who get elected or appointed and come up the river, so to speak, or east from Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. One of the gentlemen who found his way to the city of Albany was not a stranger to the annals of power in New York. He went by the name of Nelson Rockefeller. And Nelson Rockefeller had quite an auspicious pedigree, as you could imagine, from that last name. And he did many, many things. I think his last role was as vice president of the United States. He was in business, involved with the creation of Rockefeller Center. But he finds himself in Albany, and that's really where our story begins. Dr. Krinsky, who was Nelson Rockefeller, and where does he fit in with the genesis of the Empire State Plaza?
Nelson Rockefeller was one of the 4 sons and one daughter, of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was the son of the founder of the Rockefeller dynasty. Nelson was educated well at Dartmouth College. He got married as a young man and went on his honeymoon around the world, having been introduced by letter to all sorts of amazing and important people around the world in preparation for a career running things. He and his brothers were expected to run things. They were expected to run financial services, real estate investment, culture, because after all, you have to be a respectable citizen. That's what he did. That's the person he was. He was a public figure because he was the son of a public figure. And the original public figure, the grandfather, made sure that his son, Junior, was a public figure, and in turn, the boys, not the girl, but the boys were expected to be public figures, which indeed they were, including the governor of Arkansas.
Interesting. Very interesting. He was almost groomed for these sorts of perches with the governorship and such. And so as governor, he finds himself in the city of Albany, and it was a different city when he showed up. Judge Cangilos-Ruiz, the urban fabric in that time before we saw urban renewal and some of the other incursions that we'll discuss a little bit later today, particularly that Swan Street area where the complex is now. What is that area like? It's row houses and streets, is it not?
And it is a mix of a wonderful diversified population. There are Italian immigrants, there are Irish immigrants, there are Jews. And from the great migration from the South, there was a real presence of Blacks who would leave Mississippi in the South, it was segregated at the time, and come up to live a better life in Albany. And the Well-Born Temple, which was very vibrant, they brought these migrants up. In fact, in 1934, the elder Parsons was arrested in Albany for bringing up destitutes who would be on the public welfare rolls, but they were very instrumental in starting small businesses. They would be help in various households, and it was bursting with a lot of small businesses and real community neighborhood feel. There were a number of churches in that area, and there was a synagogue, and it was a neighborhood unto itself, but certainly connected to the other neighborhoods in the area.
Absolutely. And as you may sense from my Zoom background, from those of you who are joining us in the video edition of the podcast, while there are traces of that remaining, and we're so glad they do remain, there was this heavy-handed, by many people's accounts, incursion on the area in the form of Empire State Plaza. It's rumored, it's almost a myth at this point, that the idea for Empire State Plaza, which really serves as an official seat of government in New York State, it's almost like a campus for government, that it traces its roots to a particular visit from a foreign leader to New York State, and potentially even a plan sketched on a napkin in an airplane, all of this having to do with what the press dubbed Nelson Rockefeller's quote-unquote edifice complex. A lot of that is rumor, a lot of that is myth. Professor Krinsky, we have you here as an authority. What actually happened? How did Nelson come across this neighborhood that the judge just described and say, I think we could do better? How did that happen?
I don't know that it was an idea of, I think we could do better, but perhaps it was, because he did have a kind of edifice complex. His brother John, after all, had been in charge of Lincoln Center in Manhattan. His brother Winthrop was building things in Arkansas and in business as well. David Rockefeller was connected to Chase Manhattan Bank and eventually to the rehabilitation of the Wall Street area, and had done other things as well. And poor Nelson didn't have any buildings to his credit. But he had been in charge of renting at Rockefeller Center for 10 years of his life, and he understood real estate. He thought that the center of Albany was a slum, Whether it was or wasn't is another story, but he thought it was a slum and that it definitely needed rehabilitation. Well, his vision was of a grand central rehabilitation project. And he told me, and so I'm living witness, that his inspiration was the palace of the Dalai Lama
Oh,
in Tibet.
wow.
Well, of course, that's rather an unusual idea. And I was dumbfounded by this when I heard it. And he continued, he said, well, you know that when you go to Tibet, of course, I had never been to Tibet. He had been to Tibet. He said, when you have been to Tibet, you see a big wall. And behind the wall, there are towers.
Oh.
I said, yes, because I'd seen pictures of it. And he said, that's it. And I waited. And indeed, you could understand that the large substructure of the present day Empire State Plaza is the wall, and that the towers, the four towers, which are sort of like the four Rockefeller boys, big tower, which is sort of like Dad,
Mm-hmm.
egg-shaped auditorium, which perhaps is Mom.
Wow.
All of those things seem to have been inspired by the palace of the Dalai Lama and renamed for modern office purposes and for display of works of art, which were very dear to Nelson's heart.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And, you know, Professor Krinsky just hinted at some of these buildings. Many of us have been up to Albany. Those who haven't should jump on Amtrak as soon as this podcast is done and get up there and check this out in person. But Judge, what was the effect of all of this? Nelson has this Dalai Lama vision. What is it like experiencing it as a person on two legs?
Well, there was a lot of discussion in the city, of course. And Erastus Corning, who was the mayor, was really strong Democratic machine with Daniel O'Connell. And they fought it vigorously because they really knew that it was going to involve the displacement of a whole section of the city. And those who were affected, of course, you have with hindsight, you view something unequivocally now in present standards, but you look back and you see what was it that they were looking at then. And the two newspapers at the time that were very strong, the Evening Knickerbocker News, both got behind the idea and were very much in favor of putting a new face on Albany. And the squabble back and forth and the political war that went on was a lawsuit because there was going to have to be the exercise of eminent domain to take over 9,000 properties. As a result, it was only when the city failed in the effort to defend against it that ultimately they backed off.
Wow.
And, it went on for a few years in terms of the discussion. But you started seeing already some of the changes. And I have no idea, but I know that our beautiful Union Station had left the city too and went across the river. And I'm sure people were thinking, what's going to happen? But the downtown fabric, which was very vibrant, it used to be where we would go do our holiday shopping. And there were two independent department stores, Myers and Whitney's, and there was a milliner's shop, and there was so much vibrancy in the parades that would happen. Ultimately, they fell, and the small businesses that left when the population left. And I'm sure it was happening in other communities too, so it's hard to attribute it just to the development because it was happening in other cities. But the urban renewal, I don't know if Jane Jacobs ever took a position on this, but her book came out in 1962 that was published, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Albany was small, but I think it was a great American city. I don't know that she would have been in favor of the intended changes to the city and the way it was done.
Right. And, you know, Professor Krinsky, to the judge's point, a lot of communities across the country dealt with the after effects of urban renewal. But in Albany, for some reason, it seems more present. And I think it might have to do with when you approach the city by car from I-90 or when you approach it by train along the river, you can see this quote unquote edifice complex. It's very visible and it's very artistic, I might say. For those people on the ground, what was the end result and was it worth the price?
For the people on the ground, of course, they were displaced and there was no provision made, apparently, for rehousing them. There was a general proposal for some housing in a suburban district. I didn't know the details of this, but it failed because either the suburb itself or the district itself didn't want this large-scale housing, or there, in the end, was no money because the mall expenses kept rising. And they kept rising partly because of poor planning. There were people who were scheduled to work at the same moment. There were people who couldn't finish work before the next crew came in to do the next job. There was terrible cost overruns, and I think that affected the housing proposal. So the people who were displaced were on their own.
Wow. And, Judge, they also got a little creative with the financing. I think the matter of Albany County bonds was a big topic in the press. Do you know anything about that?
I do know that Erastus Corning had his hands in a lot of different things. He had an insurance business, and when it failed, I'm sure he had other plans. When he went along with it, he was able, through those bonds, to ensure that he was able to, in the contracts, have the insurance policies in terms of the construction that went on. As a result, I think there was quite a lot of money that was made. He also had an interest in the banks and the financing. So it was a very clever way of not having to sidestep it with the bonds that were issued by the county that then the state was responsible for and the payments that came in. So there was benefit from some of the businesses that were involved. And of course, the overrun of the construction costs when it went up to $2 billion, but was never the original estimate for what the construction was going to be. I know the professor knows about the art and the architecture, and they call it modernist, but when you start cladding everything with marble, and even Rutland, Vermont, where all the marble came from, so much marble came out of it that it had to close down because, and that was part of the overrun, I'm sure. They say also brutalist architecture, but where's the exposed concrete when it's clad in marble? So it really, in terms of the financing, there were overruns, but in the whole process of the number of years that it took before it was actually completed, there were cost overruns that I think the taxpayers ultimately bore. Not to mention that Albany lost a very large tax base when all of the private buildings were taken over, and now you have a government complex without adding to the taxes.
There are little details to add to this. In the first place, there was an alternative plan for another neighborhood that wasn't as crowded. So there would have been less expense, but Nelson Rockefeller did not like the proposed design. He had ideas of his own, as you could see from his fantasies about the palace of the Dalai Lama, and also an idea about the importance of modernist architecture. We wouldn't call it brutalist because the béton brut, or the raw concrete, doesn't show, and it was never meant to show. The concrete really clad steel. But he wanted something marble and palatial to impress the universe, or perhaps just to impress himself. A small piece of information may explain Mr. Corning's eventual capitulation, which he had to do anyway. But that is that the Corning family and the Rockefeller family, I was told, all summered together in Seal Harbor, Maine.
Wow.
Democrat or Republican didn't matter. They were part of the same circles and the same outlook on life, you might say. And so it just so happened that Mayor Corning was able to write the insurance for all the County of Albany bonds. Normally, a project like this would be funded by the state legislature. The state legislature refused to approve it. So the only solution for issuing bonds was, thank you, County of Albany bonds from his summertime buddy, Erastus Corning.
Wow. Everybody knew everybody, it sounds, on this project.
Well, it's interesting because one was a Dartmouth graduate, as you pointed out, Governor Rockefeller. Erastus Corning graduated Yale, and the Dartmouth Club in New York is in the Yale Club. So Yale and Dartmouth came together for this one.
It was a matter of the old boys network, as they used to call it in England, the graduates network. You go to Oxford or Cambridge and you're buddies forever. And that's pretty much what happened here. It entirely bypassed the legislature or any of the local political organizations that would normally have had a great deal to say about all of this.
Very interesting, very interesting. And of course, it does end up getting built, and it does stand to this day. And as was alluded to earlier with our little bit of Oedipin analysis here with the father, the mother, all the different figures in the form of buildings on this site, they do still stand. And for our listeners who may not be as familiar, you know, it really has a number of components, this Empire State Plaza. It's sort of oriented around a big reflecting pool. It's a long rectangle. At one end is the New York State Museum, which is an official repository of New York State history. That's on the southern portion. Then up on the northeastern portion, you have the old state capitol building framing it. And then next to the Capitol, you have a legislative office building. You have a judicial structure. And then between all of that and the museum, you have a performing arts center in the form of the oblong egg. You have the so-called agency building, these four numbered buildings that sort of pop up from the plinth, if you will. There's the motor vehicle building all the way on the Swan Street side. And then, of course, we've heard the name Corning a few times now, the Corning Tower, which has an incredible observation deck. I encourage everybody to go up there and see all of the Northern District of New York with your own eyes. And that's the composition. Of course, below, there's a subterranean shopping plaza as well, sort of connecting everything so that you don't have to go outside in the Albany winter. Then there are layers and layers of parking. And then the one that sort of hurts me a bit as an urbanist is what you see between the Hudson River and the plaza, because where there were once, as was alluded to earlier, dense aspects of urban fabric, there's now an arterial highway and lots and lots and lots of open grassy space where people used to live and do commerce and all of that. But with all of that being said, with the Renaissance in the understanding of modern architecture in this day and age, there are some who do think that aesthetically this plaza is withstanding the test of time. Speaking personally, I'm of two minds. You know, you can't look at interesting visual aspects of architecture without thinking of the people who came beforehand. So turning first to Professor Krinsky and then to Judge Cangilos-Ruiz, looking at the complex today, any thoughts on the aesthetics? And do you think, in light of all of that context, has it withstood the test of time at all?
I would not say it has stood the test of time for me.
Mm-hmm.
I find it simple-minded. It is balanced. It's not symmetrical in being identical on one side and the other side, but the four towers are balanced by the big tower and by the egg-shaped arts center. And then there's a big building at either end to close the composition. It's not remarkable in any way. It's not unusual. It's not particularly creative. It's not bad in the sense that it's not hideous. It was a missed opportunity. Also, there's something else to consider. The buildings are, I was told by architects, 44% efficient. They should have been about 75% efficient. That is to say, instead of having a lot of pipes and ducts and staircases or other things, it should have had roughly 75% usable space. But in fact, apparently most of these buildings have 44% usable space. So they built an awful lot of structure, costing an awful lot of money for buildings that are inefficient by usual standards. If you like marble and you like symmetry and you like a kind of clear composition, that's what you get. And you get a reflecting pool in the middle, and you get art 1 story down, lots of art in one of the underground layers. So it's not all terrible. It's just not as good as it should have been.
Well, you talk about the functionality, and I agree. I mean, for the size of the project, it never had the capacity. The idea was to be able to house 11,000 state workers, but the Harriman State Campus that went out in the suburbs, that actually started in the 50s with Averil Harriman, it never really consolidated all the state workers as they had thought. So I agree wholeheartedly with the lack of functionality. You mentioned the arterial, and the state had bought Union stations and all the land around it so that it could build that arterial that ran along the riverside. And of course, they then connected that to get to the South Mall project. But it quietly closed the Union Station in 1963. And here was the capital city now without that major station, another thing that was fought, but to no avail. And it went across the river to Rensselaer. I remember experiencing the South Mall after it was built. In the summer, it's extremely hot. There's not enough foliage to give you that needed shade from the sun, even in Albany in the summers. And the restaurant that was there, the sign of the tree, there wasn't even a sign of a tree that you would see. It was a wedding venue that was in the area below. I understand that Mayor Corning, one of the things that he didn't want was a lot of shops that were going to be initially in that arcade, because they were going to compete with the Whitneys and the Myers and the other shops downtown. Of course, there are some now, but the long walk that you take, yes, there's the artwork, but it just seems like a very long walk once you're in there. So experientially, if there were something at the Egg and there was a lot of good theater that would come to town, I would take the children down there. We would go for the fireworks and sit on the walls. And the museum is a wonderful museum. I have nothing but good things to say about the New York State Museum. But you also think of that neighborhood, and it was very alive during the 30s and the 40s with music, and a lot of musicians lived there. And for a population of about 136,000, there were 70 music venues that made it a very alive, captivating area. And yes, the housing was not up to the standard of Rockefeller, but it was affordable, and people who didn't make a lot of money lived there, and they made it a very viable neighborhood. So we lost a lot of good Italian restaurants. We used to get our bagels down there on a Sunday morning, and a lot of those businesses, when they didn't have the population to support them, just folded.
I can supply a footnote about trees.
Please do.
Going to be trees, and Nelson Rockefeller envisioned that they would be trimmed in rectangular form, as some trees were at the Chateau of Versailles, the royal chateau of Louis XIV in France. This was the kind of vision that he thought was somehow appropriate for a city of 145,000 or something like this, in low-key, low-scale, semi-rural environment. But it was his idea of glory and grandeur and some kind of expression of the importance of New York State. But New York State and New York City were founded for commercial purposes, not for these ceremonial and grandiose purposes. There's a difference between Albany and Washington in that way. Washington was founded as a city that was to be representative of a new form of government. Albany was founded because it was it was developed because it was the great junction point between the Erie Canal and the Hudson River.
Absolutely.
Fortunately, it turned its back on the river and didn't take advantage of its location for once that arterial went in. They tried later to try to develop it, but I think it lost what it could have been had development proceeded in a different fashion.
Now, we've mentioned the art collection a little bit, and I don't want to pass that one by right away because Professor Krinsky is not just an architectural expert. She, of course, specializes in modern art as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that collection and how those pieces found their way to the plaza?
Well, I don't know the whole story about the art collection because I was focusing my research and interests on the architecture, but the collection is a good collection of works of art that were part of a generation of artists. For example, there's a very nice George Siegel sculpture. He makes human figures that look like human figures, and they're made of plaster or whatever else they're made of inside. They're plastered over in white. So the figures look like ghosts in a way, but they're recognizable and comfortable for people to look at. People understand what this work is. And as I remember it, the figure is painting part of a wall at the end of a trajectory, so you see it at a distance. And there's a very nice horse. I mean, there are all kinds of good works of art there. One of them, a very large painting, was so large that it had to be cut into thirds to be brought into the mall. But for about 10 years, it was installed badly. 2 of the panels were perfectly aligned. The third panel was installed a couple of inches too high. So this long continuous thing did not look long and continuous. Finally, somebody forced people to lower the third panel and make it look proper. So it was a question of Nelson Rockefeller's taste, a certain level of understandability for the general public, a certain lack of intelligibility when the collection had abstract art, because a lot of people did not want abstract art. So the art collection was to some degree very welcome and necessary to pep up that layer of the mall. But on the other hand, it wasn't altogether intelligible or popular with the local people because most people hadn't been trained to study abstract art or semi-abstract art or distorted forms of human beings or animals. And there wasn't a lot of information available to explain these works of art. There could have been probably much more public art instruction in the schools or afternoons with the artist or something of the kind on the wall to make people really appreciate the often very fine works of art that do improve the appearance of the Albany Mall, the Empire State Plaza.
Right, exactly. and Judge, there are so many government functions that happen within this complex. And so, you have this art that's on display even underground. You have concerts that take place down there during the luncheon hour sometimes. As a former government official yourself, do you think the plaza is conducive to those government officials who work inside, whether it's in any of the 3 branches?
Well, I think it's the cafeteria, the fact that you can be right there. They have trucks, of course, that line the street in the summer. And it gives an opportunity for state workers to get out and get some sunshine after being indoors, even in the summer, to go past the reflecting pool and go back inside. So I do think that for a worker who's there, and I do have a family member who works there, they find it conducive. They have parking right underneath. That is very convenient. But some of the workers will just come into the city. They follow the arterial and the expressway to get under the building. And then at 5 o'clock, they get back in their cars and go back out to the suburbs. And so again, this whole issue of urban renewal for the rest of the city, I don't think they are the workers who would be going out and going downtown to another location to shop. They're going out to the malls in their area. So it's a mixed bag.
Right. And Professor, I'd like to ask you, this is a very delicate balance, and there are a lot of opinions on this topic, but in your view, do you think it's acceptable for architects and architecture to force positive social interactions, or do you think it's acceptable to simply have the person drive in and drive out? What is the role of the architect in the building in fostering community?
The idea of fostering community simply was not anything that anybody thought of. People thought, apparently, of enhancing the dignity of Albany by putting up this complex. They were not thinking of the neighborhood, obviously, because they demolished it. They were thinking perhaps of rising land values around the mall, which is what has happened. The idea of community or of keeping the population close to those two nice department stores and to the little bodegas and to the Italian restaurants was completely uninteresting to anybody who planned this complex. The idea was dignity and impressiveness and modernity in an old city and competition for either attention or something, whatever you want to compete with. That was what was going on here. It was not a question of enhancing neighborhoods or comfortable lives for the citizens.
And I go back again to the 1962. If it wasn't until 62 that Jane Jacobs issued and published her book, those ideas didn't, I think, get any traction with the general population until later. And everything was already set in stone at that point. The contracts were all there. They probably, that whole neighborhood lived through the boring of steel girders and the dust that was created. And I remember we would go to Lincoln Park, and living through that area when that whole area was under construction. The museum just turns its back on Lincoln Park, but that had been the area for sledding and Red Cross lessons in their park in the summer where you would learn to swim. And it was really beyond that immediate neighborhood. You could walk there and enjoy it. And it completely transformed that. So they weren't thinking of it, that's for sure. And it was too late by the time Jane Jacobs' book came out. She was successful in New York City, but unfortunately it didn't affect Albany.
Well, I'm not sure she was so successful in New York City. She praised Greenwich Village, which is where she lived, West Village particularly, which is a neighborhood that is landmarked and it wasn't landmarked at the time she wrote, but that's later. But it was landmarkable because it was a little enclave of low-rise buildings that were cozy and neighborly and full of little shops and people who'd been living there for a long time. It was utterly different from most of the rest of New York City anyway. It was her ideal, her dream of a community, but it couldn't easily have been exported elsewhere. With rising real estate values, with competition for space of new kinds of structures and facilities. And imagine what Google might have done to Albany if it wanted to move to Albany. There would have been a monstrous building plunked in the middle of the city.
Well, she did stop Robert Moses, and that Manhattan Arterial didn't go through, and Houston Street is very wide because they started making that effort. So I agree with you. She might have not been totally successful, but at least she preserved a good part of New York that we know and love today. And Soho is there because of her, I think.
Yes, and because artists said, oh my goodness, there's a really cheap neighborhood with a lot of big spaces that we can use for our big abstract paintings.
And we can't understate that that ideological crucible, I'll call it, of the early shoots of the preservation movement, preceding World War II, of course, but it was in those years following World War II where people like Jane Jacobs were really starting to get their advocacy going against real gargantuans like Robert Moses. One has to wonder, if it had been a decade later, 5 years later, 3 years later, could this deal, this cobbled together deal, have survived? And a companion question really is, without Nelson, would it have ever happened? And turning to you, Professor, since you're the only person in this conversation right now who met the man, tell us about this man. He's a forgotten figure these days, but what was he like personally?
Well, I didn't know him well. I was granted a long interview with him because I had been writing a book about Rockefeller Center. And I wanted to ask him questions to which I already knew the answers, just to check and make sure that my book was accurate, and also so that I wouldn't be sued for anything. There's nothing scandalous about the book or anything else, but I was just afraid of any kind of legal problems. And that was the occasion in which I interviewed him. And at the end of the interview, I asked him whether he saw any connections between Rockefeller Center, which everybody loves, and the Albany Mall, which a lot of people didn't love. But I didn't put it that way. I just asked if he saw any connections between the two. And he said, yes, he did. And by the way, he would tell me something else about the Dalai Lama and the connection that he saw between the mall and the complex in Lhasa in Tibet. But I can't say that I knew him personally. I knew about his career and his 10 years of selling real estate in Rockefeller Center. There were rumors at the time, and I have no idea of their falsity or their truth, that the Rockefellers undercut other landlords by arranging low rents for a certain period of time to get people out of other office buildings. But I don't know whether that was the case, because I have no proof of it and never found any such proof. It may have been a rumor started by other real estate interests.
And Judge, as you were coming of age and beginning your practice and going through life, what sort of place in the American imagination, in your view, did Nelson occupy?
Well, my first exposure was New Year's Day. He would open up the governor's mansion, and my family would go down to be able to take a tour of the governor's mansion. Now, I don't know. I'm sure that he did not spend that much time there, although in 1963 he was there when there was a big fire, and he ran out with his wife to avoid getting burned. And I understand that there was some talk at the time, because there had been so much damage to the first floor. It was an electrical fire in 63. It wasn't because someone was antagonistic about his plans to build the South Mall. But I know that there was, at the time, there was talk by him that he had thought of then just raising the governor's mansion. And who knows what would have been built there. And of course, the governor's mansion is very proximate to this whole area. There was the cathedral that was left, the Catholic cathedral, and the governor's mansion, and not much more of a neighborhood. He was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, everyone talks about the Rockefeller Republican, and he knew how to, at the time, he didn't make much in his national place, but as a governor, I think he was well remembered for certain things that he did.
Right, and you can point back to things like the creation of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and deposing Robert Moses from his post, unifying many of the agencies, adding a certain aesthetic flourish to the state of New York, and really just consolidating the image and the self-image of the state, I would say, in many respects. Governors who followed have certainly tried to imitate that in many respects, I would say. And of course, there were Nelson's personal issues. That's not really the topic of today, but there are a number of rabbit holes folks listening at home could go down. But it's a complicated legacy, and it's a complicated complex. And as we sort of close our conversation about what Ada Louise Huxtable once referred to as the $1 billion worth of high camp rising ominously on Albany, I'd like to close with hearing your thoughts about the past, the present, and the future. And I'd like to frame this question in this way, and we'll start with you, Judge. This plaza is now named for Nelson Rockefeller. Over the next decades, it'll have a number of significant anniversaries. Eventually, it'll turn 100 years old, and there will be conversation about whether this should be preserved or whether something new should happen there. So I was hoping you could just share with us, and then we'll turn to the professor. One thing you do enjoy and appreciate about the complex, and one place where you would think we should focus our preservation energies, if any, in the future.
I would like to see some more trees. I don't know if that's the cost of their care of it, but I think it would help to have some more shade and bring some of the wonderful park system that Albany had and still has into the mall. I was very fortunate to spend a number of my years at Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna, and they had come. These were downstate attorneys who had come as counsel to the governor and moved upstate and loved it so much that they wanted to stay. And our firm was very close, right? Kitty corner to the Capitol and near the mall. So when we had to go to meet with the health officials and any other agencies, it was very convenient in terms of being able to, from our office, walk across the street and be right there to have our meetings. I don't see in the future that they are going to be making many changes to it, because obviously with inflation, the costs of doing anything differently there now would be enormous. And it still is a viable complex in terms of its use for those who are able to work there. There is an advantage to having the justice right there, the legislature, and some of the agencies. So I do think that that vision of having them be able to intersect and be close by does facilitate at least the ability to meet. So I think it's here to stay, would be my prediction, but I would love to hear what the professor thinks.
I think it's here to stay too. And one of the most recent considerations that makes it permanent is that if you demolish a building, you have to do something with what you've demolished, so that it creates a tremendous amount of waste. And we aren't supposed to be polluting the world anymore with some of this waste. The other thing is that then you have to rebuild, and that is wasteful in itself. Now, it's true that if the buildings are only 44% useful, there's been waste already. But do we have to compound the problem? No, I don't think we do. So I'm guessing that these monumental buildings made of steel and concrete and so on are here to stay. And they are monuments either to, well, what shall we say, ambition, folly, imprudence, carelessness about the past population. Whatever we can learn from these buildings may be valuable lessons for some time in the future. We shouldn't repeat the bad parts, and we should use the good parts that are still usable.
Very interesting, and what a fitting note to conclude our conversation. So I think with that and those thoughts about the future planted firmly in our heads, we will thank Judge Margaret Cangilos-Ruiz for her time, and we will bid adieu to Professor Carol Krinsky. Thank you both for such an interesting conversation, and I think our listeners will thank you for all of their frantic Google searches, catching up on even more of the nuances and details. Judge, Professor, thank you so much for your time, and we'll have to keep this conversation going with a cup of coffee at the McDonald's at Empire State Plaza. What do you say?
Fine, the next time we go up there.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And listeners, please stick with us. While our guests are leaving us, we have a very special surprise for you at the conclusion of this podcast. Thank you again to you both, and listeners, stick with us.
Wrecking Ball is brought to you by the Historical Society of the New York Courts, which is dedicated to preserving just that, New York's vast legal history. For more information about that important group, just Google Historical Society of the New York Courts or visit history.nycourts.gov.
Everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Carol Krinsky and the Honorable Margaret Cangilos-Ruiz as much as I did as we delved into the history of Empire State Plaza up in Albany on the banks of the Hudson River. But we're back with a different voice now to share in our favorite segment, which we call our Daily Ada Louise, where we take a look at the rich and varied archive of the incredible architectural critic, formerly of the New York Times, no longer on this planet, but whose legacy really reverberates through the ages. She was such a passionate voice for architecture preservation, and I would say civil society and the rule of law as well. And I'm so pleased that for this segment, we have a very special guest to chime in, a woman who has not just very deep ties to New York State as a whole, but also to the city of Albany. But her many varied efforts throughout the field of architecture, urban design, and general historic preservation wonderfulness includes a stint leading the famed Municipal Art Society in the city of New York. And she was also really the tip of the spear when it came to getting the FDR Four Freedoms Memorial going out on Roosevelt Island, east of Manhattan in that same Hudson River we just alluded to, but a little bit further south. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Gina Pollara here. Gina, how are we doing today?
I'm very well, Adrian. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here with you.
Oh, likewise. Gina and I have been friends over the years, and she is one of those leading voices on preservation issues. And Gina, what are your ties to Albany too? Because most people think of you as a New York City player.
Exactly. I was actually born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my parents moved to Albany when I was 7. I grew up in Albany and was there until I went off to college in Vermont in the 1980, I guess. And then I moved here after Bennington and have been here for 40 years, hard to believe. But my parents, when we moved to Albany, the Empire State Plaza was actually under construction.
Oh.
So all of the clearance had already taken place. And I have not very many memories of the construction itself, except for the theater that they call the Egg, because that actually got completed sort of late in the process. And that was considered a pretty amazing engineering achievement, just in terms of how it's anchored to the ground. I have many, many memories walking around the Empire State Plaza and also walking through the concourse level with all that amazing artwork. You know, there's just this miles long underground concourse that has this collection of huge scale modern art. I was just up there in the New York State Archives, which is actually in the building that's shown in your background, and had an opportunity to walk through the concourse, which I haven't done in years and years. And it's amazing, the quality of the collection that's down there. It's really quite astonishing. And to bring that sort of quality of art to the public is really remarkable, and also something that I remember quite well.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to use the phrase cradle to grave because the Empire State Plaza is still with us, but you've seen it from at least cradle to maturity. And that's a perspective that we're so glad to get here today on Wrecking Ball. And I believe you may be participating in our Daily Ada Louise using a quote. Do you have a quote you would like to share with us that we can discuss?
I do, and this is something that she expressed in many ways, you know, over multiple essays and articles. So, the cherishing of the aesthetic and urban achievements of the past is critical to the quality of our environment and our lives. To lose history is to lose place, identity, and meaning. The continuity can be achieved only if the past is integrated into the contemporary context in a way that works and matters. So I think that's relevant to the Empire State Plaza since it was such an enormous, urban renewal, what we also call slum clearance. They wiped out, obviously the large Black community and also a large Italian community when they took all this land by eminent domain. And as much as and I'm probably one of the few, love the architecture of the Empire State Plaza, it proves her point. It hasn't integrated the past at all. And so it kind of lives as this odd, weird bubble that almost the architecture is very space age. And I mean, it has become very identifiable as an icon of the capital city of Albany, but it also is not at all linked to the past of the city. It doesn't have that context. It doesn't incorporate the past at all into what they did. And so in that respect, I think it proves Ada Louise Huxtable's point that, you need to mix those two things. And it's not about just the slum clearance. That's not what's going to give our cities and towns and villages character, an urban tapestry, or even a small town tapestry. You need to have all of those different threads woven together to create sort of a rich environment.
Right. And what a fundamental irony that the state's official repository of history is located in the plaza, and yet you and others make this critique that it is disconnected from history in spite of its rich history of construction, which we've discussed throughout this episode. And I have to say, I am one of those fellow appreciators of the aesthetics of the place, but of course you cannot untangle it from how it got here and what it means for the future, right?
Right. And that is what makes it so complicated, because I do love Wallace Harrison. He really was Governor Nelson's, go-to architecture. He was involved in the United Nations here and designed the two towers at the northern edge of the campus. And, he did a lot of different architecture and worked with Nelson Rockefeller for a long time. So it's understandable that he would be chosen as one of the architects for this. But as much as I, love the architecture, it just has zero context, and it's when you think about what was lost to put that up, and that there wasn't at that time any sensitivity about wiping out communities. It's both an example of what you shouldn't do, even as much as I like the architecture itself.
Right, absolutely. And as we know, the themes of this podcast are preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. And so I think as we draw to a close here, I think back of your image of arriving in Albany as a girl while the land had been cleared, but the buildings haven't been built. It reminds me so much of a scene in another great podcast, The Big Dig, where a gentleman who was in Boston was looking out at the land had been cleared for the expressway and it hadn't been built. And in that case, the expressway was ultimately killed and replaced with rail lines. But in this case, of course, the Albany Mall was built. So I guess, Gina, in closing, what advice would you give to people at that crossroads of preservation, the law, and the city as they're asked to tackle great projects in the decades to come? What lessons should they learn from Empire State Plaza? How should they do it?
Well, I think there needs to be a sensitivity towards the communities that are there. Towards the structures that are there. Obviously, there will be structures that aren't necessarily worth keeping, that don't have architectural merit or are unstable or need to be cleared. But I think if things are done with a light touch and a nuance, I think that's the one thing that is missing. Is there's hardly ever a nuance in these slum clearance projects. They need to go in, and I think that's something that Ed Logue, who was the head of the New York State Urban Development Corporation, learned when he was doing work in New Haven, that you need to go in and work with the community and have an understanding that it's not just bulldoze everything, and you need to kind of attack it with a much finer grained lens.
Right, absolutely. Such wise words for us to consider, especially in this era of mega projects, right? When hundreds of millions of dollars are shoveled out there, right, Gina?
Well, this is, I think, when you look at places like Hudson Yards or even the Empire State Plaza, there's no scale.
Mm,
It's, you're dwarfed by this mega project, and it then becomes somewhat alienating. And there's no place for the public or community to take root. And it gets further divorced from any sense of belonging or place.
mhm. Right. And why do we care about place? Because it is the stage set that allows all urban life to happen, as Tony Wood reminded us in our premiere episode. Those are
Exactly.
wise words, Gina. Any other final thoughts for us as we ponder the long and lengthy history of Albany and Empire State Plaza and government architecture as a whole?
I think that, brutalism, and this is considered by some as brutalist architecture, I think it has some things to offer. And I know there's a widespread movement to sort of eradicate all the brutalism, but I would argue for really trying to preserve some of the great examples of it. And I actually think this is one of them.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. And we have to remind our listeners, right? The same arguments we hear against preserving brutalism, we heard against preserving Art Deco, and everybody loves that style now, right?
Exactly. Exactly. You don't know what's going to be popular in the future.
Right, exactly. Well, these two odd ducks here will continue that flame. But in the meantime, we thank so much Gina Pollara for joining us for our final segment here today, and our prior two guests, Carol Krinsky and the Honorable Margaret Cangilos-Ruiz. And with that, we will invite you to keep joining us on this journey through preservation history on Wrecking Ball. Stay tuned wherever you are listening to this podcast now, online, and we will talk again soon. Speak later and have a great day.